in principle, now RFK is going to be running the show on the health front. I don't know what that's going to look like or how he's going to manage it. One of the fundamental problems I think that he's going to have to address, and this is an incentive problem. I mean, if you want to make a system work properly, you have to get the incentives aligned with the aim. And that's very difficult. It's something that behavioral psychologists specialize in. And one of the problems on the prevention side is that it's very difficult to give people credit for prevention. You know, if you go for a drive and you don't have an accident, nobody pats you on the back, you know, but you've prevented innumerable catastrophes if you drive, 100 miles safely. You're not going to get credit for things that you do intelligently that stave off a catastrophe that doesn't exist. And so it's very difficult to associate scientists, let's say, or physicians with effective preventative strategies because the evidence that they've done something good is subtle and it takes a long time to make itself manifest. That's way different than, well, was it Barnard who did the first heart transplant?
Neil Barnard.
Right.
I used to play basketball with him.
Right,
he was
right.
friends with my father.
Right,
yes.
Right, I remember
but he learned how to do the transplant at Stanford and Texas Heart. But because of our regulatory issues in the United States, he took the technology, flew back to South Africa and did it there.
Yes, yes. Well, he became world famous, of course, for doing that. And that's not prevention, that's cure. And you could tag him, immediately with the prevention.
Jordan, I lived this. I was exactly what you're describing, taking incredible pride in what I could do with a scalpel and a stitch.
Yeah. Yeah,
I could change hearts. I could put mechanical hearts in. I could now begin to change the valves.
It's very dramatic and immediate.
But we taped shows in this. We had New York Med, which is a news show that was filmed in the hospital that did very, very well, airing on primetime television. Right on the show, the Dr. Oz show, we'd go into hospitals and show these dramatic moments. It's fantastic.
Right.
There's so many TV shows that have been successful, from Marcus Well Beyond to the ER and down in House. There's there's a reason for it because it's exciting. I don't think the issue of prevention is that you don't get credit for it. The issue of prevention is more about how do you create a system where it's easy to do the right thing.
Yes, well, that's the incentive issue, of course.
And that's where I believe our government has been of very minimum value. Because if the NIH was able to put some support behind looking at the actual tactics that might work, getting rid of the ones that are ineffective, reinforcing the ones that do help Americans, then we'll start to develop mechanisms to make our lives a little better. Ironically, there are differences even between different parts of the country in the health of our people. Just learning from that would be effective for us. But no private sector business is going to do that because they're not going to be able to pay their shareholders back for that invested money. That's something we as a people should do for ourselves. And that's an example of one of the topics for the MAHA movement. Regulatory bodies should be responsive to us and should at least be able to explain why they're not spending money in a way that might make sense for the betterment of the average American. And we also should not be directly misleading them. I mean, you chum the water by telling people to eat a low-fat diet. I mean, you eat only meat. You've lost weight, you're sharper, McCullough's rheumatoid issues are better looking, your boyish good looks never better. All those things happen, but it's not an accident. And the fact that it's
also impossible to believe.
Well, I think that's part of it. Why is it impossible to believe? Someone long ago, because these ideas are not new, these bad ideas have been battled for decades. Someone long ago should have been honored by at least hearing their ideas, and we suffocated them. Kill these ideas in their infancy. And so now
do you think that, okay, so let's talk about something more radical. When you were talking about the NIH and these granting agencies, I thought about a conversation I had with Larry Arnn, who's the president of Hillsdale College. And Larry is quite the force of nature, and Hillsdale is a remarkable institution, right? It's one of the few universities, legacy universities, let's say, which has maintained its appropriate function. They have a 1% first-year dropout rate, right? The average is 40%. 1% is stunning. And it's a lovely campus, and the students are very much on board. And the typical student there told me that 90% of their professors were excellent. And I asked like 15, 20 students, and privately, so they could actually talk to me. In any case, one of the things Hillsdale did was not take government money right from the beginning. And it's very interesting. Like, I don't exactly know what to make of this, because in the beginning stages of my career as a researcher, which was quite extensive, because I published about 100 papers. And the reason I'm saying that is because I want people to know that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to discussing the research environment. And so I did research at McGill and Harvard and the University of Toronto, and that all went really, really well. The only fly in the ointment that entire time was the emerging power of the research ethics boards, which became, in my opinion, corrupt beyond belief and absolutely 100% counterproductive and woke. They were awful. And they started out bad and they got rapidly worse. But something, again, seemed to happen somewhere around 2014. And the research enterprise, which was in the main, in my field, in psychology, relatively free of careerism and relatively free of corruption. Like, not everybody who was doing research was a great scientist, but you can't expect that. And most research wasn't true, but you're going to have a lot of misses. But virtually everyone I ever met who was seriously involved in the research enterprise was doing it above board and ethically, and they weren't careerists. And also the scientific journals were trustworthy, and the granting agencies were too. And then something twisted in the last 10 years, and I think none of that's the case now. I mean, Science, the greatest magazine in the world, greatest scientific journal in the world, and Nature have both become ideologically corrupt. Scientific American is pretty much gone. I mean, that's more on the public side, but it's an emblematic of the same thing. I mean, there's the replication crisis, so to speak, never shocked me, because I never thought that most things that were published were true. That would be too much to hope for, but some things at least were true. Now I wonder, like, I don't see a pathway forward, a straightforward pathway forward to rectify the granting agencies. I mean, even 20 years ago, the typical scientist in the United States was spending 1/3 of their time writing grant applications that failed. 1/3 of their time. That's insane. You basically sidelined 35% of your researchers in producing paper that has no utility whatsoever. And things have got much worse since then, because you have to be ideologically pure now to get a grant. You have to have your DEI statement in order, and that's the first order of business. And so, do you think, is that a rectifiable situation, or was the trajectory inevitable? If you have government finance research, does it become corrupted by government corporate collusion? I don't know. Like, I'm not really sure what to think about that.
Much of what the young people do is mirroring what their professors and teachers are doing.
Well, which is what they should be doing. They should be mirroring it. That's the whole point of the education system. Yeah.
They're rejecting it en masse because it's a failed ideology. And they're also realizing, to paraphrase George Orwell, who, as you know, was a journalist, was sent up to the coal mines in northern England, and he quit after a few articles. And he argued that he thought the socialists cared about poor people. It turns out that socialists didn't care about poor people. They hate rich people.
Right.
And so when the professors don't actually care
they hate successful people.
Yeah,
that's even worse.
But that's what you start to see. All of a sudden, the faculty who are leading these onslaughts of, to revise the institutions they're pretending, performative again, to pretending that they care about the poor patients who are being left behind. They actually just hate the system. And if you're going to blow the system up, you better know what you're going to do next. Metaphorically, to one of your 12 rules, make your bed first. Mm-hmm. Just get the basics right. Telling a young student that he has to use pronouns to a person who's not going to appreciate that is the opposite.
Which is like 95% of people, right? Because that is not the highest concern of 95% of people, especially if they're going to a hospital because they're sick. And to have to, I can't really imagine, as a clinical psychologist, a worse way of demonstrating a better way of demonstrating my cowardice in the face of an ideological onslaught and the capture of my imagination than by stating my pronouns and asking for them the first thing I do when I met a client. I would never do that under any conditions whatsoever. It's absolutely preposterous. It's precisely announcing to someone, first of all, my ideological position, which you should not do, certainly as a therapist, and I would also say as a physician. You're not to burden your patient, your client, with that sort of information. You're not there to make a personal statement to them. You're there to listen to them. And so you shouldn't be starting out with an announcement of your ideological position. And you're also telling anyone that who can think that you're too weak to stand up to the woke mob, which is not exactly something that's going to strike confidence in the heart of someone who's on their deathbed and hoping that you can help, or in some sort of terrible crisis.